Something that became apparent to me about a year ago, when I first became interested in Marxism-Leninism via the work of Infrared Haas, when he debated Joel Davis and Keith Woods, is that having spent as much time on the right as I have, there's a lot missing from the left. This made it difficult to make the jump even over to something like infrared MAGA Communism, which in many ways mirrors elements of the right. What am I getting at? Simply put, as a recovered schizo poster, the fringe doesn't exist on the left the way it does on the right. Even the most extreme elements of the left are nothing compared to the right's esoteric Hitlerism, pagan imperialism, and Christian identity. I found myself severely itching for a little internet psychosis, but I couldn't find it outside of occult and witchy circles, which as a Catholic is more or less a total no-go. So what was my solution? Here's where things get tricky. Either I could have rejected the tinky tendency I had adopted and gone back to the right empty-handed, or instead could do a little thinking and understand where the left is coming from on this issue. As a mecha-tinky infrared MAGA communist, I understand we aren't part of the modern left in any meaningful capacity. The left currently is defined by the new left of old, which has evolved to now be simply the left. But at the same time, the infrared sphere doesn't act like the right in the same way either. So when Haas starts talking about reaching out to the right in the MAGA base, who represent the working class better than the intersectional left, I thought this could be an interesting place to finally get this overlap and some closure. Now, I don't need someone to walk me through this. It became pretty obvious by the time Haas was talking about MAGA communism what the distinction is between the fringe right and this absent fringe left. The answer is that the left is the tool of the regime and therefore can't see past it. A perfect example is the various left comms and libertarian socialists of switch communism, who despite being communist, hate every communist country, not just in existence, but ever. They fully buy into the same talking points the CIA has been spewing about foreign relations since the Cold War began, and have progressed up to this point doing so all the same. The average millionaire Twitch communist doesn't make up the working class in a substantial way, nor do they represent an ally to the working class. If anything, they're class enemies. I don't want to get too far into the discussion of left comms, dem socks, and the like, but do me a favor. Take this statement at face value, and tell me the rest of my argument doesn't make sense. The faction that fervently sides with the establishment cannot in any meaningful way be revolutionary. So who is this establishment I mentioned? Well, I can tell you who it isn't. It's certainly not the MAGA base or Trump himself. Let me elaborate. The election of Trump represents a catastrophic failure of the system to perpetuate monotony. The general process of boiling the frog, stealing from the people, securing power, etc. had to be accelerated, causing a mass reaction. We had a loose cannon pop up and shake up the regime and ignite this fuse of vigor in American politics. Think of how utterly disturbed the regime has been in response to Trump's election. This can't be just because he isn't one of the boys. It's not a simple elitism at play. It's a more broad one, but not necessarily a conspiratorial or even secret one. Think of this. The first bipartisan issue in years was a disapproval of Donald Trump. What does this mean? How do we understand this? Trump wasn't a part of DC. He was a man who wanted to move things forward, shake hands, get stuff done, and ultimately, as the slogan goes, make America great again. The purpose of bourgeois democracy was never to improve the life of the people, and it certainly isn't now. So this man comes in and says, I'm going to improve your life, I pose an existential threat to the people who make your life worse, draining the swamp in other words, and I'm going to ignite a passion within the American people we haven't seen in a long time. Given he didn't live up to all his promises, and there were long times where his constituents were completely blackpilled by his actions, but overall he fulfilled his promises pretty well for a recent president. Here's where the conversation gets more interesting. The left, meaning the radical left, excluding the infrared types, despite constantly condemning the Democrats as equally bad as the Republicans, and even counter-revolutionary, always seem to come out to vote blue no matter who. The radical left, which once again doesn't include the infrared sphere, exists to enact revolutionary policy and do damage control. But the problem is, when they get their politicians in power, think AOC, they don't do anything revolutionary. Therefore, damage control, voting for the more progressive body, becomes not an action of damage control at all, but an active and conscious support of the regime. Back to the conversation of schizo posting for a second. The left has plenty of room to adopt schizo rhetoric, but they don't because they are the conspiracy themselves. The left goes beyond being the weapon of the regime. They're a distinct force duped in committing violence for the regime. They're the brainwashed slaves. They aren't Vladimir Lenin, they're Lenin a crow. There's a reason that Haas has moved on from caring about the synthetic left and now only seeks to win over the MAGA movement. For one thing, I was a Groyper before I heard about Haas. When I watched him debate Keith and Joel with Logo, I laughed out loud when someone pointed out in the comments how Haas just spews off big words, and then moments later, the video queued up to Haas spewing off big words. So I came from the MAGA base. I think I'd know better than anyone that I can point to that MAGA can go Marxist. But but there is an underlying challenge with certain individuals. Two bases I can never see going Marxist in our current circumstances are schizo-boomers and schizo-zoomers, meaning the QAnon soccer moms and grandmas, and the trad cat sedevacantist conquistadors, or the esoteric Hillarists of Generation Z. If you still use quote-unquote message boards, you're not coming on board. How do we circumvent this? I don't think it's a good idea to willingly leave behind certain demographics for being too fringe. I think instead we ought to frame it in their terminology. That is not to say we become schizo posters ourselves, or become suspiciously supportive of people probably afflicted with paranoid delusions, but instead that we ought to help them conceptualize their worries from our worldview. In fact, a lot of things we don't disagree on. It's just that the synthetic left immediately plays damage control for those in power the moment you point a finger at them. Let's take a look at the Great Reset conspiracy. Oh boy, I can already hear the independent fact checkers at the bottom of my video. But for a second, let's think of how the right conceptualizes it. The Great Reset is billionaires taking your property, paying everyone the same wage as a UBI, and collecting all the wealth upwards to themselves. In other words, down to the very misconception that communism is when everyone gets paid the same. This perfectly fits their definition of communism. What about this? What if instead of allowing them to call it communism and pull what the synthetic left does and just simply say, that thing that the elite believe and have said they want to do to you doesn't exist? How about instead of that, we say something to the effect of, this is peak capitalism. The rich want to own everything, so we have to rent from them, give everyone a maximum wage instead of a low minimum wage, and have the wealth concentrated into this hyper-bourgeois class. This is peak capitalism. That's how you approach this in a way that the right will understand our perspective. I doubt this will ever get through to the synthetic left, but that's because they do what the regime tells them. If the regime came out and said, we have achieved true communism, trademark, the synthetic left would believe it. What would more likely happen is that if we presented things this way, the younger crowd would get it and adopt the rhetoric and worldview we come from, because the regime would have to adopt contrary narratives. If Marxists start opposing things like the Great Reset and Malthusian agenda, do you think the regime will really say, we must be tolerant and understanding to our comrades? No, they'll say time for fascism, and the Azovite leftists will agree. They'll adopt an alternative ontology to deal with us accordingly. The regime can't say the opposition is right, but not entirely, because they can't lend us any ground because we will win if they do. With the advent of MAGA Communism and the recent success of Haas's MAGA rally experiment, it's obvious that even down to the basic understanding of Marxist concepts, the revolutionary subject is not the person with they them in their Twitter bio, it's your mechanic. We return to when I asked you to humor my statement, the faction that fervently sides with the establishment cannot in any meaningful way be revolutionary. The only side opposing the regime is the MAGA base, if for no other reason than that they frequently contest elections. Keep in mind, the synthetic left despises liberal democracy, except for during the election cycle. It's all big talk, and then the second the establishment needs support, they line up rank and file to cast a vote for the yellow dog. Even despite the fact that Haas had to lean off the heavy use of the C word, I was shocked to see how easily the MAGA crowd agreed with Marxist-Leninist principles, and even articulated them without themselves knowing they were. In order to get them to adopt our rhetoric, we need to adopt theirs, because unfortunately, language is tied inextricably to politics, so they can talk about government for the people without realizing they're talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat. They can talk about the elite screwing us over without realizing that this is tied to their control of the means of production. They can talk about the struggle of the common man without realizing they're talking about alienation. But if we direct language not in the way the synthetic left does, via censorship, but the way the right does, via dialogue, we can finally find a populist solution. I'll leave you with this. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeois today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the race of modern industry. The proletariat is a special and essential product. Karl Marx.